Do you have a tough challenge with your supply chain or logistics? Loguru is the intelligent partner that works globally with manufacturers, retailers, and logistics businesses. We help our customers define, buy, and safely implement solutions across the supply chain. If you want a more sustainable future for your supply chain, visit loguru.co.uk. Complete end-to-end satisfaction guaranteed.
Coming up in this episode.
No, we just used to call them sandbaggers. You know, they were going to overachieve their budget. It was like, well, no, there's no point me overachieving. The maximum bonus potential that I've got, if I go beyond that, I'm not going to get anything more.
The Logistics Collective podcast is a series focused on the logistics industry, where there are many incredible stories to be told. We'll be speaking with those who've worked and are working within the industry today. What have been their experiences, good and bad, since joining, and would they recommend a career in the industry to others? Here's your host, Malcolm Pope.
Hello everyone, welcome to the next podcast in the Logistics Collective. We're doing something a little bit different today, and we're starting a series. We're calling the series Alas, and it is a conversation between myself and a wonderful supply chain professional called Keith Holdsworth, who I've known for a long time. We had a series of conversations and we enjoyed having them, so we thought we'd like to share them with you. Why did we call it ALAS? Well, it's supposed to stand for, as an acronym, Advanced Logistics and Supply Chain. But we thought about Alas Smith and Jones. So the late and great Mel Smith and Griff Rhys-Jones used to have a comedy series in the 80s and 90s where two people would have a bit of a conversation, and that's the way we felt some of these conversations went. That itself was a skit on Alias Smith and Jones, which was an American Western series from the 1970s, but there you go. We didn't call it Alas, Holdsworth and Pope, simply because Holdsworth and Pope sounds like a really ancient company of very dusty auditors, and so I felt it was better perhaps just to go with Alas. So, welcome, Keith. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Of course, Malcolm. I was thinking, actually, Holdsworth and Pope sounds quite like a funeral undertaking kind of company, doesn't it, as well? So
it really does. I can't see you in a black top hat walking in front of a hearse, to be honest.
Either way, not a good look, yeah. So, yeah, well, I've been in supply chain pretty much since I left university. My background and interest was always mathematics. I studied mathematical engineering at Loughborough University. And I guess that gave me quite an interest in how to apply mathematics into the real world. And I was very fortunate in that I got a graduate program with Bass, the brewer. Although I got placed with Britvic Soft Drinks, which was no bad thing, but obviously when you were thinking you were going to join a brewery as a recent graduate.
You were distributing Britvic 55.
We did Britvic 55, we did orange juices, mixers, but we were the Pepsi franchise, Tango, Robinsons. We had, outlets into supermarkets, but pubs, hotels, everywhere, as you can imagine. And I used my maths and mathematical engineering because the first job that I ended up with was in the forecasting function, and that really got me into supply chain. I had experiences in the production sites, in the warehouses, and when I got into planning, I did some production planning, and then got my first real job in sales forecasting, which I did for a few years, and then gradually worked my way and understood a bit more about sales and marketing in general, and how, particularly promotions in an environment like soft drinks, there was an awful lot of effort that we had to put into that, and new product launches.
Sure.
I went from there to a different FMCG background, into household cleaning, personal care, and pharmaceutical products with Reckitt Benckiser, and then moved on from that into fresh milk, looking after the liquid milk supply chain. So that was quite entertaining because obviously it was a very short shelf life and very minimal inventory, and then went to the complete opposite extreme and got involved in agricultural chemicals, and spent probably the last 12 years or so in that before I went into supply chain consultancy, and I've been doing that now for probably about 4 years or so. But as I say, it's all been really about supply chain. I've always liked every element of it, but particularly the sales and operations planning process, because of the way that it overarches kind of all of the end-to-end supply chain. So I've touched on quite a few things in my time, and as you say, it was probably it was certainly more than 20 years ago that we first met. And it has been really good to continue to have conversations with you throughout.
So here's your memory test. Where and when did we first meet, and why did we meet?
We met because we were trying to set up a collaboration between our various different FMCG companies at the time. We had an idea that we could be much more efficient from a logistics standpoint if we shared some of the regional distribution that we made into retail outlets and regional distribution centres for some of the smaller customers. But we each had different third-party logistics providers, which made it quite a challenge, but it also made it quite an open table because we weren't all trying to bring a particular kind of drive behind one provider. So actually we found that we got 3 different major 3PLs to talk to each other because we were sort of forcing them to as the clients of theirs. And I know we had great success in the southeast. We managed to get a decent, I think it was about 8% saving in some of the distribution that we were doing into the southeast of the UK, just purely by making sure that we were sharing deliveries, because you had heavy products, I had heavy products, and we found a friend who had large volume but very light products. So it made a perfect harmony in how to deliver to some of those places. I'm thinking from a year, if I had to guess, it'd have been about 2005, maybe. So something like 18 years ago now.
Yeah, it's probably about right. I would have said, I think I first got involved with LUPEG 2002, 2003, and then I led the FMCG Collaborative Working Group within there. LUPEG still continue. I think our greatest disability at the time was application of technology. And the idea of how do you actually get that large-scale alignment, because you had to do it you almost had to do it on a strategic level. Can you get businesses to sort of say, well, we can get on and it sort of works, and it works at a top-line level, but you also had to have tactical elements within there. Strangely enough, given the fact that the number of empty trucks running around on the road, or suboptimally loaded trucks that are still running around our roads, it arguably has not yet reached its potential, but yeah, I'm having some discussions about that at the moment still. So let's see if we can get to it.
Well, I think the other part of this was that the idea was to go from a full truck to an empty truck as fast as possible, and by being able to join our deliveries together meant that we could do that by consolidating a delivery.
Yeah,
and rather than running 2 drops, 3 drops out of a truck and gradually reducing the efficiency and load fill on that vehicle, it just made sense to go from full to empty and then start using it to be something else rather than running part full for however many miles.
So, Keith, what's your choice of refreshment today?
I have a cup of coffee with me.
What sort of coffee?
Because we've run out of instant coffee.
Go on.
I've got a cup of filter coffee that I am very lucky to have a little machine in the office that I work in, and every so often I load it up. So I've got rather a nice cup of coffee, Taylor's of Harrogate coffee.
That beats mine. I mean, actually our Nespresso machine went bang last week, and we've ordered a new one and it has arrived, but then it's lazy me in saying, oh, I've got to fill the milk container and do all of that, and no, I can't be bothered. So for me, it is I'm having a Nescafe Azera Americano instant coffee at the moment. So, and
other coffees are available, of course. We weren't intending to particularly advertise anything, but yes.
Well, no. But then you were also asked to bring along a snack. Now I've got to prepare mine at the moment.
Oh wow!
Because mine needs a bit of preparation, and I know you can hear things going on, and it's really important that this happens, because you can't actually do this without actually preparing. So I have a stroopwafel.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah. And it's got to go over my coffee for a bit of time so
Yes.
that it warms up. And the reason that I chose the stroopwafel is that hopefully, although my favourite biscuit is a simple old custard cream, stroopwafels don't make as much noise as a custard cream when you're eating them.
Brilliant. Well, you see, that's really clever.
So there's some planning that's gone into this. For the next one, it's going to be more interesting.
Well, I fail in many respects because I'm trying to keep off the biscuits and the cake for whatever reason.
It's wise.
So the only thing that I permit to come near the office is, are some unsalted nuts, mixed nuts.
Nuts, Keith.
Nuts, yeah. Lots of people have told me that I'm nuts over the years, or crackers at least. But yes, so I have a selection of unsalted nuts, which in theory are quite good for me, as long as I take them in moderation.
Okay, so you're having a moderate intake of nuts with a Taylor's of Harrogate filter coffee.
But you just having said that, there's a little bit of a risk about how crunchy they are. That's now making me think that I'm not going to be eating any of these. So I'll just put them to one side.
No, I think the technology can take care of that. I'm going to dig into my stroopwafel any moment soon, but it's got to be the right temperature and the right consistency before it is.
Yes,
so,
definite.
So our topic of the day is, I always felt, and due respect to the dearly departed lady, I always felt it was the Mystic Meg part of supply chain, and so we're talking about forecasting.
Yes.
And sales and operations planning.
Yes.
So from your perspective, whilst I'm about to go and dig into me stroopwafel, what's the point of forecasting?
I've heard lots of people ask that question over the years as well. It's like, what's the point of you doing all of this? Well, fundamentally, done well, a good forecast is incredibly powerful for you to get an outlook on how the business is going to perform, what you need to do to allow it to perform. And through a process like sales and operations planning, you can assess, where you've got challenges to meet, whether they are sales challenges that you need to close a gap between what you're expecting to achieve and what you budgeted to achieve. From an operational perspective, think about manufacturing, distribution, logistics. What are the things that you need to have in place in order to allow the plan to happen? But they all have to be interconnected. They need to operate over a horizon which is relevant, because some decisions are quite long term. If you want to add some more warehousing, for example, you need to have that view many years, not many, but a few years in advance, perhaps. Or you can go to a spot market for it. But things like whether or not you've got a new product that's coming into the mix that you need to do something particular about, whether you've got some materials you need to order and they're on quite a long lead time because they come from overseas somewhere. There's lots of decisions that as a good company you need to make on the appropriate timeline. And by having something which is a forecast at the appropriate level with a decent amount of accuracy, and I'm sure we'll probably talk about, what do you call decent?
It's on the tip of my tongue, along with the next piece of my stroopwafel. See how many times I can say stroopwafel probably incorrectly during this.
Do you get some kind of kickback for this? You haven't mentioned a brand, I suppose. In truth,
No, I haven't. No, I haven't.
So you're all right still.
It used to be a favourite sort of wake me up whenever I was in the Netherlands. It was something rather sweet and unctuous and pleasant to eat. So I'm having a Dutch memory at the moment.
Good. Yeah. So as long as you've got something which is reasonably accurate, and if it's by reasonably accurate, I think you can get too obsessed with, can you make the perfect forecast? And actually, I'm quite a big advocate of the fact that you probably can't, and you don't have to worry about that. If you've got a decent S&OP process, if you've got a range of, it could go as high as this, or it could go as low as that, and my best guess in the middle is the one that I'm going to make my plan around, but I'm going to understand what I'm going to have to do if I end up on the high side or on the low side, and how big are those kind of variations. As long as you've got something that allows you to get a feel for that, the process is about discussing what are the actions that I want to take to deal with those kinds of situations.
So Keith, if I can cruelly paraphrase you, what you're basically saying is that forecasting is structured guessing.
Structured guessing, or even unstructured guessing. I still remember once having a discussion with a commercial team where I managed to try to persuade them that I could be more accurate than they could be if I guessed how many orange Smarties were in a tube of Smarties. And they took a little bit of exception to that. I was at one of their big commercial conferences, and they didn't particularly welcome the fact that I was suggesting that the value that they were giving me wasn't really what I needed from their forecasting.
So do orange Smarties taste different?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm absolutely convinced they do. Right, but it might only be a mental thing.
Yeah,
yes.
It's another Nestle thing we've got going on here. So, but there you go. Well, we're not focusing on you, Nestle, honestly.
Other sweets are available, and other chocolates are available.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, of course they are. So, we talked about forecast accuracy. What, in your view, is a reasonable percentage of forecast accuracy?
I go back a little bit to the point I made about you have different levels of forecasting hierarchies. You have certain decisions you have to make on certain timescales, and the further out you are and the higher up those kind of hierarchies you are, then you tend to find that you can be more accurate if you're not really worried about the detail. If I just had to try and estimate what my total sales were going to be 5 years out from now, you'd probably pick a number and you'd be relatively close to what you think you're going to achieve. And I say relatively close, so let's say you'd be within 5% perhaps of what you're going to do. But as soon as you start to drill that back and say, okay, so what am I going to sell next year? But what am I going to sell next year of a particular product in a particular retailer? And then actually go from the year down into months, down into weeks, down into days. The granularity that you start to introduce into the forecast brings with it error. And because there are lots of things that can influence somebody picking up a product instead of a different product, things like which one was available on the shelf, stock outs still occur. And all of a sudden you've sold something different to what you thought you were going to sell. Or better the thought, your competitor has sold something which actually the customer was going to try and buy your product. So you get a lot of noise as you get down into the lower levels of granularity. If you can get something which is appropriate for your supply chain based on how long the lead times are that you need to replenish, how often you review your forecast versus your actuals, what sort of lead time you need for some of your raw materials. If you create and I should maybe add, and what are those raw materials? So if you're talking about the cocoa that needs to go into chocolate, you need to procure that on a very long lead time. You need to have made agreements and arrangements to get that on a very long lead time. But
sure.
Do you know how much chocolate you need in 3 years' time? You might have a pretty good view of that. But how do you get that chocolate into which different mixes and recipes that you've got? How do you get that into different size bars? How do you get that into the different customers that you're going to sell it into? There's more and more granularity that comes along, and it gets harder to try and make all of the things at the lowest level make sense. But of course, that's where, you go from long-term planning to a medium-range planning, which is typically where the S&OP arrives and sort of tries to discuss it. And then you have an executional level right in the short term at the front end of this, where you're really looking at how are the actual orders behaving compared to the plan and forecast that you put in place, because you're going to need to react in the very short term, because I need more in this product label versus that product label, and it's a slightly different recipe in this one to that one. But so it varies really.
If we're looking at the sharp end then, and I'm thinking this is, well, mainly in our experience, going to be talking about FMCG. What would be a number? If we're looking at a sales forecast that you're going to be, really looking at, how has this informed me on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis in terms of delivery of finished product to customer?
I've seen in most consumer goods that a lot of supply chains try to build around either 2 to 3 to 4 weeks of inventory. Most supply chains don't try to operate on much less than that unless you can't.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, my fresh milk example, we barely had half a day of inventory overall. But then you've got lots of things that you could flex between which size of milk carton were you going to put it into, which label were you going to be able to try to use for it, where were you having to deliver it in the country was changing. So you had a lot of things that actually made it possible to operate fairly low levels. But I think most people operate with 2 to 3 to 4 weeks of inventory. So typically speaking, as long as you can hit something less than 25% error or something more than 75% accuracy, depending on how you say it, you ought to be able to operate in a certain amount of stability. It doesn't need to be very much better than that from what I've seen and experienced, but it does link a little bit to, you might have other constraints, and quite often you start from almost a process where you assume infinite capacity of production and warehousing.
Yes, please.
And then you have to constrain it to. But in the real world, I can't do that. So where do you have to trade things off? And very often you'll end up obviously having to run with less inventory than you targeted on certain products. But if you go from 14 days down to 12 days on your very, very fast moving products, which are highly kind of repeatable, very stable demand, actually those 2 days probably don't bring you any risk whatsoever. But the opportunity that might give you to create a volume of a slower moving product that could even be a whole month's worth of that slower moving product, those are where the trade-offs of changeovers versus inventory versus manufacturing flexibility all start to play in. But if you do a reasonable job of creating a fairly accurate plan, then the changes that you need to make in the executional horizon should always fit within the flexibility that you've actually got to your operation.
So thinking about the creation of a forecast, what are the constituent runes or tea leaves or pieces of dried seaweed or crystal balls that you're actually using? What
you mean I can't use Smarties?
You can't use Smarties, no.
Okay.
No, you've used that once already. But if we're looking at it, how do you build a forecast? Is what I'm saying.
Well, so this is where if you can get a hold of consumer data or as close to the point of consumption data, because I accept that different industries are completely different, and I suppose in many respects a lot of these conversations are easier to explain using consumer goods types of supply chain.
Sure.
But you can absolutely replicate the logic to any supply chain. You just have to apply some appropriate adjustments because you're actually talking something else. But let's consider consumer goods as the sort of supply chain we're thinking about. If you can get the EPOS sales, the till sales of what is being bought, then you've got the cleanest view of demand that you can. But for now, you do also need to understand whether there were any impacts on shelf availability, whether there were some stockouts that were appearing through the chain, which meant that what people would have normally bought, they weren't able to buy. And you're going to have a pretty good view of that because that's probably linked to, were you supplying what the retailer was asking for? So that sort of start point of consumer data or the purchaser of the end product is the cleanest place to start from. And then as you work your way back and you think about the way that we replenish into the retailer, or they may replenish from a distribution center, So then they'll have created their own kind of potential additional noise in the signal because they might only replenish in full pallets or crates or something into the store. And then you go back to that regional distribution center for the retailer, and they will order from the manufacturer in what they think is an efficient way, but that might always mean that they order a full truck. So they'll have created a little bit more noise on top of the original signal because they'll have done something to try to be a bit more efficient, hopefully. And then that becomes orders that you're seeing in your system, which you might try to forecast, because that might be the only data that you've got available in some ways, unless you pay for EPOS sales or you're in a collaboration with a customer, then maybe that's all you can see. So that's already maybe a noisier signal. And then you try your best to forecast that. And then there are all these other outliers that throw into the mix. And actually, from what I've seen over the years, some of these things that look like external signals, for a long time, I've called them causal factors, just because when I've ended up in a conversation with somebody else, we ended up calling them causal factors. But these other things that influence the demand, which are kind of, well, it's nice to think that they're going to be relevant, but it's things like, what's the weather like? If you're thinking about soft drinks or ice creams or something like that, it's like, well, how warm is it? Is it raining? Is it on promotion? And if it is on promotion, where is that promotion? Is it something that really grabs my eye because it's right at the front of the store, or is it just like a little shelf promotion of something? You can think about other industries and say, hey, maybe if it's product related, some of the things like is the wheat harvest looking like it's going to be strong this year, and therefore there's going to be a big requirement for products relating to wheat. Or, what's the commodity price that the farmer's going to get for a given product, because they might not be interested in applying certain products unless they're going to get a good return. So there's all sorts of factors that go into why am I seeing the demand that I'm seeing, plus your own in or out of stock situations. So if you can understand some of those factors and you can record those along with the demand that you've actually experienced, what you tend to find is that can explain quite a lot of the behavior that you're seeing. And providing you get some good causal factors that are absolutely connected to the demand, then you can actually get really good correlation between those and what you then expect to see as future sales.
So Keith, help me out here, because what I'm sort of hearing is that we're looking at demand as it happens, and we're putting an overlay of whether it be season, weather, holiday periods onto that. And we're then maybe thinking about bigger market impacts and then promotional activity for your own business and promotional activity for competing businesses coming into this. But that sounds quite reactive rather than proactive. To some extent, you're looking at what's happened in the past, or what we think is going to happen. Where does commercial come into, let's say, the development of a forecast? Where does that piece come into it?
Well, that's usually, if you found, I'll try and stick actually on this consumer goods idea, and let's stick on promotions as an idea. Let's say there's a product at a given price where you run a particular kind of promotion, whether buy one, get one free, which are more or less banned, but buy two, get one free, it's maybe 25% off price reductions, or these types of activities. As long as you record those different activities, the level of discount that's occurring, you look at, well, where is the placement of that promotion? So this is the sort of the shelf impact. Is it right in front of me as I walk in the store? Is it just tucked away somewhere else? How long is that promotion running for? Because there's a recency approach to this. So the first time you see a promotion, a lot of people buy into it. The second time, a bit less. The third time, even less so. But you create those models based on history. And actually, you can use technology, use AI to help you to develop the correlation between these different factors and the demand that you see. And once you've got those models, what you need in order to predict what's going to happen in the future is the future idea about what promotions are we going to run. Because you still need those same things. You still need what kind of mechanism, how much of a price reduction, where is it going to be in store, etc., etc. And you can only get those because the commercial team are the ones who are negotiating those with the retailer. So the input that they have to give you is, what am I expecting to run as terms of my activity plan? And as long as I get a good sight of that, I can use my history to try and give me a profile of what will happen because of those future promotions. Now, it's never going to be perfect. I mean, the data that, when I've done these in the past, the data that I've seen is that you'd be really surprised how good they can become. But what you then do when you go live with the promotion is you start to look at day 1 sales, day 2 sales, day 3 sales, and the profile that those first few days actually exhibit along the curve of cumulative sales you expected for the promotion, they are a really good guide. So if you put a curve together that said, this is how much I think I'm going to sell over the course of the promotion, as you monitor it day by day by day, you will get a feel for if it's plus 10% after 3 days, it will finish plus 10% after 28 days. It is really, really, well, it's not exact, but it's going to be a really very close estimate to what you're going to end up with after 4 weeks. And that is as good a guide for, I don't want to overproduce, I don't want to underproduce. But if you look at those first few days of activity, it's often a very good insight into what's going to happen over an execution horizon of a few weeks. So that type of information, and that's where, even if you don't have an arrangement to get all of the EPOS data out of a retailer, if nothing else, if your commercial team can say, tell me after 3 days how much have we actually sold, you can get a feel for what that really starts to look like. So that, both the input up front and the post go live, after a very short horizon, how is it actually going? Those are 2 key things that the commercial team can help you with.
Okay, thank you. Thinking about the sort of 25% that doesn't work out, if you were looking at perhaps what are the top 3 reasons that give you that 25% of inaccuracy, where do they come from?
I think, I've never really done a breakdown of that, but I would suggest that most of the inaccuracy will come from either, I'll give you a short list of sources. One will be because of supply related issues, and as supply people, I think these are the ones that we have to stick our hands up and say, that's in our court, we didn't make enough, we didn't plan enough, or, the truck broke down or something like that. So fundamentally, we didn't have the availability that we wanted, and therefore we didn't sell what we thought we were going to be able to sell. So there's certain examples that will definitely exist where it's related to the supply of the product. There are other examples where the forecast has been, it's been inaccurate in its own sense, and maybe because you didn't have infinite manufacturing capacity, you had to allocate product between different customers based on the product that you knew you'd got available. And you'll have done that based on the forecast that you had. And you can get forecasts that are either high or low out of a commercial team quite regularly. And I like to think that there's probably 2 main reasons why you get errors from a commercial team. The first one is where you get the over-optimistic salesperson who is maybe looking at the budget they're expected to achieve, maybe looking at what they've done so far and saying, do you know what, this new product's going to come in and that'll fill the gap, so it'll be perfect. So they enter a number which is optimistic, to say the least, about what they're actually going to achieve. And on the reverse of that, you have what I like to refer to as the sales hero, who likes to put something that's quite pessimistic into the forecast, because maybe they're already doing quite well against their budgeted targets, and they say, if I actually put in what I really think I'm going to sell, there's going to be a problem because I'm going to get asked to deliver it, and actually, if I don't commit to it, it's going to be better that I come on later and deliver more. So you get this like sales hero type of approach where they put in a slightly pessimistic number and think that over delivering it is going to be better. So I think you can certainly have both of those examples, or rather all three, I suppose, if I bring in the supply example. But certainly from a commercial perspective, I think that there are extra sort of maybe they're almost like mindset challenges that come into play as to whether or not I really want to accurately forecast, whether I intentionally over and under forecast. And maybe that's where sometimes you're really relying on your demand planning team that quite often will sit in most organizations to try and be a bit of an honest broker and try to say, you've said this, but actually I'm going to put this into the forecast because I don't think your number necessarily makes sense. But I think this is a good example of where you need to try and make salespeople sort of understand what the implications are of the two scenarios that they may play out, and try to encourage them to have the best forecast accuracy.
I'm still pondering over pessimistic salesperson.
No, we just used to call them sandbaggers. It was the guys who they were going to overachieve their budgets by however much, and it was like, well, no, there's no point me overachieving the maximum bonus potential that I've got. If I go beyond that, I'm not going to get anything more. Really sort of selfish almost attitude of it. But if I go beyond the maximum I can achieve, then I don't want to do that. I'll keep that. I'll do something else with that next year or something. So that type of scenario.
We all have in our career the conversations that are interesting. From my perspective, it's always been from a savings basis, and it's going up to, shall we say, a senior director and saying, okay, I think if we do A, B, and C, we can save a further 3%. And then the response comes back. It says, well, I've made my target this year already, so no, I'm not interested. That for me was probably one of the most demotivating conversations I ever had. But there you go.
Yeah.
It is interesting because there is always a point of friction between, I guess, supply chain and commercial, and I wonder what the resolution is perhaps to look at how people are targeted.
Yes. Yeah.
So is supply chain, sales, and customer focused enough? Question, but is commercial focused enough in terms of being truly honest brokers as far as the information they're giving back into supply chain?
Yeah, I think this is where, if you look at sort of ongoing products, I think that this is where there's a strong argument to say that statistically, you could probably use some sort of mathematics to try to make a sensible forecast for things that are just ongoing, and actually, asking salespeople for their opinion on something which is quite a stable product and is just ongoing is fairly pointless. You might as well just have somebody centrally say, how many of these are we going to sell? And particularly if it's a branded manufacturer who can sort of share it out over different customers, and by the time you've taken it up another level beyond an individual customer, and you've said how much are we going to sell in total of this particular product, then you're actually probably better off just doing something at a central location. But these inputs that you get on specific activities like promotions or new product launches and those types of things, to understand what's really happening with those from a commercial person who is really close to the customer, that's where you're meant to get the value. That's what you really want. So actually, if you're going to incentivize commercial people with sales forecasting, don't just put everything in there. Accept that you're going to split the portfolio up a bit and say, I don't want you to bother forecasting those. I just want you to give me something that's going to help me do these parts of the forecast well.
Yeah.
And that I think is a key to it, really.
So I think looking at forecasting, it clearly has value. I mean, I think the way to imagine value is to imagine what would the world be if we didn't have, what would the world be like if we didn't have forecasting? And to my mind, you can look at a pragmatic scenario which says if you don't have a forecast, the reality is you have the infrastructure in manufacturing and supply chain that you have, and that has a capacity. So the only thing that can happen in that circumstance is that customer supply is impacted. Lead times and basically will increase, and you will get unhappy customers. The other side is if we have, and this is where we come to the other pole, if you like, is to say, well, what if we didn't have? What if we had delimited, de-restricted manufacturing and supply chain? So you had manufacturing machines that were infinitely flexible with infinite capacity. Then, and you could move it away quickly enough and get it into your customers. Then the argument there would be that, well, would you need a forecast? No, possibly. And in that circumstance, you wouldn't need any inventory either.
Yeah, but you probably, from both a capital perspective and fair enough with automation, maybe in warehousing, who knows with autonomous delivery whether that will start to drop into it. But if you create that infinite capacity model, you're going to pay an awful lot of cost over the top of what you really need. And that's where your trade-off really is, isn't it? It's to try and set a level where your costs are appropriate for your operation. And maybe you accept that there's some periods of peak activity where you can't cope with what's going to come at you. Now, I'd like to think from a distribution and warehousing perspective, you still have to be able to deal with the peak. I think that's different. But from a manufacturing perspective, perhaps there's something to say, I can do this by profiling my production slightly differently. Pre-producing is okay. But if I pre-produce, then that I have to accept that I'm going to create an inventory spike. And through that inventory spike, I've got to be able to deal with that in my warehousing process. I've also got to understand that the cash flow impact of the working capital I've just put into all of that inventory. And arguably, if I'm buying my raw materials for that on an earlier lead time as well, I've tied up quite a lot of cash through a pre-production process. And doing the ROI and the calculation between those to understand what makes sense to pre-produce and how much reactive capacity to put in place, they're all calculations which are eminently possible, eminently sensible. So just working those through.
But do people do them?
I don't think enough people do them to enough of an extent.
Yeah, I'd agree. It is a little bit like early experience of working on activity-based costing, and you did it once and left it there.
Yes.
And I used to make me giggle like hell. So it's inactivity-based costing. Then you do it once and forget about it. And you understand the reasons why is that there's limited bandwidth in terms of teams and people and all of that. But there is a value to look at most efficient method of producing and moving things through a supply chain on a dynamic basis. So looking at it, I think the conclusion is, what is the point of forecasting? Well, it has a significant point because it's got to try and square the circle of, occasional unreasonable demand versus very much constrained capacity, and it's got to find a route through that keeps customers still buying your product, going through that, and that's the reason why it has its point. But how could it be better?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things that come to mind in some factors that you might consider you're part of the supply chain. A lot of businesses think about their business, but both upstream and downstream, if you can try to integrate better and collaborate better to consider the whole of it, then you're going to be in a lot better place. So if I give an example, we talked about chocolate before, but I mean, it could be anything. It could be chemicals, it could be cardboard, it could be anything. If you collaborate with your suppliers better to give them some sort of insight into what you're, based on your demand, based on what you're expecting to do, what are you planning to give them in terms of the orders for the materials, it can help. And particularly on long lead time materials, you know, if you think about cocoa and, you know, you get to a point of, well, am I going to have enough cocoa in the pipeline to be able to deal with all of my demand? The decisions that you're having to make on that are you know, many months out. If you're using your forecast to talk to your suppliers effectively, then you will be in a position where you can not only secure the material that you think you're going to need, but you will probably secure it at a price which is much more advantageous than suddenly have to go and buy a load of cocoa on very short lead times on a spot market when everybody's desperate or something. You know, buying it 12 months in advance on a contract versus buying it 1 month in advance because they're the only people who've got any cocoa left is going to be a very different dynamic. On the same vein, if you start to do those things where I was talking about consumer demand actually pulling things through the supply chain, if you're talking to your customers or even their customers or the end users, you know, if you're going as far down to understand the drivers behind it, then all it's going to give you is a much better insight into the reasons why you're seeing what you're seeing. You know, and those conversations are, and you said earlier, you know, the reason where we really were challenged when we tried our collaborative project was because of the systems, because of the date. Now we're 18 years further on. It's probably a very different backdrop to being able to actually provide some more of that integration, but I'm not sure everybody's really trying to go down that path. I think people are still quite insular in looking at how their business is performing rather than really trying to take the collaboration kind of angle.
It is very silo-based even today, which is a surprise. That would have been something that I would have expected. I mean, even 18 to 20 years ago, the technology to be able to, at least on a one-off basis, to say, well, how can you join this up and make it better, existed. The only thing that didn't exist was the intention to ask the difficult questions. I think if the area of supply chain wants to drive innovation, we've got to begin to structure the really challenging questions we'd like to get an answer to. So it's almost asking the impossible question. You know, can I get absolutely perfect fulfillment on the basis of all of the restricted elements that we have within there whilst operating sustainably? And all right, that's a bit of an ugly question, but the essence within here is that I don't think we're being bold enough with the questions that we're asking the bright bods that are innovating away in the wonderful world of information technology. And I think we should demand more. I think we should demand more of our ERP systems. I mean, very often, you've got many businesses sitting on a similarly branded ERP system, none of which talk to one another in any real intelligent way. Transactionally, yes, but no, there's no real intelligence being used. So the big data element seems to be missing.
Yep.
So what do you think the future holds? What in terms of forecasting, where do you think it's going to go?
Well, I think very briefly mentioned the use of artificial intelligence at being able to help forecasting. I don't think that everybody will switch en masse to all forecasts being generated by computers and it'll be the holy grail because they'll make a better job of it than people. I don't think that will happen. But what I do think would really help forecasting is the use of something like artificial intelligence to create these connections with some key parameters. And if more companies understood what those key parameters were, these causal factors that I talked about, if more people understood what those were and, tapped into data sources that are available for those causal factors, then people will end up explaining what's actually happened in their demand a lot better. And that will help to create, because you almost, you start to remove some of the anomalies out of your data, and you create a bit more of a, so providing none of those things happen, this is what my forecast should be. And actually that forecast will be more accurate than the thing that you're creating right now, which is just purely driven potentially just on customer orders. So if you go through those steps, you'll end up with something which is a more accurate start point. But I think then you've got a layer to add on top of it, which is about the collaboration, because the information that you're given from either people upstream, downstream about what's happening in my material availability, what's happening in my demand, real demand, those pieces are in the collaboration of where technology will start to give you the real power. I mean, I used to see quite often we'd have 25%, 30% error on a forecast. But by using this type of approach, we could get ourselves down to about an 8% error on a forecast, which is a considerable step forward. You think about how that means you haven't over-ordered, you haven't over-inventorized a particular product, but at the same time, the reliability of your supply to your customer and therefore to the consumers is massively increased. Going through these relatively simple steps and building those pieces on top of each other can make a really substantial improvement. We were talking about a third of the error of what we used to see before we did those extra steps. So I think that's where I think with technology, you're going to see that becoming more available to more people. Because at the time, that meant a lot of investment, really, to be able to get to that step. Whereas now, that's something which is a lot more openly available. So I think that's the direction I imagine it's going to go over the next 5 years or so. I think beyond that, we'll be into a completely different dimension, to be honest.
For me, I'd look at it almost in the area of science faction. So,
I like that.
I see the, I sort of see that, everybody has had a focus on EPOS data. So we're really looking at what's happening at the point of sale. But it's erroneous in the sense of that only tells you when somebody's putting it in their shopping basket. And thereon after, it then disappears into, we don't really have any supply chain disciplines domestically. There's certainly no systemization of it, in truth. Even the retailers, when we're looking at home shopping, their apps are, from my perspective, pretty unintelligent in terms of what they do. And in my sense, what you actually want to understand is when has somebody consumed something, and once they've consumed it, are they going to buy it again, and when? And I can sort of imagine some future where I'm talking to, I'm not going to call it Alexa. I think we're going to need to have something called Madge or something like that we speak to and say, Madge, that can of baked beans was awful. I don't want those again. Yeah. And it's that sort of interaction that I would say that then would be fully joined up to say, okay, I'm getting some really interesting data coming through, maybe. But then you've then got to have the overlay of the influence, because a lot of the promotional activities as well, does it really in the fullness really drive increase in sales, maybe increase in profitability? I'm not convinced.
Yeah, well, there's so many different variations on it, isn't there? You take your can of baked beans, can of baked beans might be quite a staple thing. There might be something that you more or less order every week, let's say, 8 can of baked beans. So then you might decide.
Surprisingly, given my history, I don't. But there you go.
But let's say if you did order a can of baked beans, you might easily say, well, it makes more sense for me to order a 4-pack of cans of baked beans once a month.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the retailer's got to work out that, you're ordering 1 4-pack every month, and your consumption is 1 can every week. So when you start to predict, do I need to have beans available? You're doing a combination of, but this particular customer consumes them at this rate of a can a week. But what they actually order is a 4-pack every month. And as soon as you get into sporadic history, so maybe once a month is not a bad example, because actually if it were once per month, then that's actually quite has another regular kind of pattern. But you'll have lots of things like that. No, your instant coffee, if you had to guess when you were going to buy your next jar of instant coffee, so therefore, retailer is trying to estimate when are you going to order your next jar, they might be able to work it out to, well, the last jar lasted for this long. The jar before that lasted for that long. But overlaying the seasonal perspective of it, maybe you have more coffee in winter than you do in summer, and how does it trigger? But then maybe a promotion kicked in and you got something free if you ordered it at a particular point. All of those things start to become so many different data points, that that's where this kind of artificial intelligence kind of meaning, because it can look at so much more data than just the pure, you ordered one of those on that day, and the last time you ordered it was then. That's where all of that power comes from. Starts to give you something which is much more useful. But then once it's done that, you still need to apply to it that, well, are we going to do another promotion on that jar of coffee? Because if we do that promotion, that's going to mess up this demand, and that's where my sort of semi kind of intelligent forecasting process kicks in, because your computer takes you so far, and if there's something that you never promote, then maybe it'll work perfectly. But some point in time, you then need, what are we going to create? We're going to make noise in the supply chain, and what is going to happen as a result of that noise. And you can understand it retrospectively what it did, but you've got to try and guess when those points of noise are going to happen in the future, and that's where you still need the kind of human impact, I think.
So Keith, to sort of reinforce my point, I'm going to ask you a question, which is, Keith, have you ever cleared your pantry out or your food cupboard?
Of certain things, yes.
Yeah, but have you ever sort of done that stock take that says you have got that 12-year-old can of grapefruit segments at the back that's sort of happily rotting away in the background? Have you ever actually done and had a look at that from a best before end date or use by date basis?
Yeah, but I'm trying to remember what it was that I found. It was something that was clearly bought maybe as a fairly unique purchase, and then because of the way that the shelf kind of hides things, doesn't it? But I really can't remember what it was. But I'm quite obsessive about, if we bought something, the oldest one goes to the front and the newest one goes to the back, and you want to be able to see them all, sort of thing.
But our kitchens aren't really designed in that sort of sense,
no.
And nor does the tech that we have help with that. Which is why we put about 7 million tons of food into landfill each year.
Yeah,
in this country.
Yeah. No, well, you see, I'm from Yorkshire, and we don't like any kind of waste. So there's always something which must trigger in my mind that eventually, I, on a fairly regular basis, I think I must do some sort of check of what have we got.
I'm going to send the pantry auditor down to you.
I'm saying this, I'm relatively confident that there's probably not anything which is particularly out of date.
You're confident? I'm going to send the pantry auditor down to you.
You're going to put a postscript, additional addendum to the podcast of, so what did you find? What was out of date in your cupboards? Yeah. There will be something, I'm sure.
I actually like the concept of mystery and suspense, but, so, I mean, this has been, for us at least, everybody else might have, sort of being unconscious at this stage.
Switched off hours ago, yeah.
Yeah, they probably have. And, if we've managed to send somebody, who's suffering from insomnia to have some restful sleep, so I'm quite happy with that. But I think the conclusion is it's necessary, it gives value, but it has so much more potential to be more than it is today. And I think that's by embracing all of the organisation and all of the organisations and actually taking a much broader view of it would seem to be the conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, Keith, what do you fancy for our next discussion? Because we were talking about collaboration, and that sort of sparked a few ideas in my head. Do you want to talk about collaboration, or have you got something else on your mind?
Yeah, well, I think collaboration, but the other thing that did go through my mind was one thing that I don't see very much happening within the S&OP process is that A lot of people think about manufacturing. If you're lucky, some people think about procurement, so the upstream part of it. But I don't think that we do a great deal about how to take what we think we're going to do into a logistic sense. That kind of activity planning through an operational level. I don't even see people I don't even see people in the room very often that look after logistics.
I used to call logistics was the home of blame in FMCG, because in essence, it's where everybody mistakes landed. Yeah. And in essence, it had the responsibility to try its best in order to correct those mistakes. And if it couldn't, then it got the blame. And for me, it was a wonderful walk through is, okay, we get our ducks in a row and we begin to walk up through the supply chain. And that I've had a great deal of fun with in the past.
Yeah. So
but you want to have a look at the interface between forecasting, S&OP and logistics.
I think that is an often overlooked part of the S&OP process. As I say, I don't often see people who are in charge of logistics, in charge of the warehousing network. I don't often see them really involved in many of the discussions that are happening. They're expected to have the rubber-walled warehouses. They're expected to have trucks available. There's no driver shortage. I don't care what you're saying. They're expected to deal with everything. And I think that could be a little bit of a build to some of the things that might be. If I think about our target of the logistics collective, maybe that translation into how it really impacts in the logistics sense could be could be an interesting topic, perhaps.
I certainly think so. So let's give that a go. So look, Keith, thank you so much. I think very, very interesting input on forecasting. Not a wonderful performance in terms of, nuts. We wanted to see something more.
I'm going to have to think better.
You're going to have to think better than that.
Better than nuts, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think I will.
I've had my stroppy waffle and enjoyed it. And thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time, Keith.
No problem at all. Thanks, Malcolm. Speak to you soon.
So that's it from this podcast. Just a reminder, you can catch up with all the previous episodes of the Logistics Collective podcast on our website, logisticscollective.com, or wherever you get your podcasts from. And remember to click follow and we'll let you know when the next episode is released. Until next time, bye for now.
You can get in contact by email, podcast@logisticscollective.com, or leave a voice message on our website, logisticscollective.com. The podcast is a production by Le Guru.